The courtroom was silent for only a second before erupting into laughter. A sea of white faces, judges, officers, attorneys, mocked, snickered, whispered behind their hands. A woman stood in the middle of the chaos, her wrists bound in cold, unforgiving steel, her dignity stripped from her like an old coat. The police officer, a smug grin stretched across his face, leaned toward her, his voice laced with poison. "You really thought you could get away with it, huh?" He chuckled, shaking his head in exaggerated amusement. "Typical. You people always think you're smarter than the law. But here's the thing, you're not. And now, you're gonna spend the rest of your life rotting where you belong." Her stomach twisted. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even shock anymore. It was rage, deep, burning rage that sat heavy in her chest, that threatened to spill over with every breath she took. She had spent her entire life proving herself, climbing a ladder that had been set on fire from the very first rung, forcing her to push through the flames. And now, this man, this racist, power-drunk cop, was looking at her like she was nothing. Like her degrees, her training, her career meant nothing. Like the badge she had dedicated her life to meant nothing. The judge, a heavy-set man with cold, dead eyes, cleared his throat, silencing the room. He looked down at her from his elevated seat, fingers drumming against the polished wood, barely hiding his smirk. He didn't see a professional, an expert in her field. He saw only her skin. "This court finds you guilty on all counts," he said, the words cutting like glass. "You will be remanded immediately without bail." The officer clapped his hands together loudly, mockingly, before turning to his fellow officers, exchanging high fives like a sports team that had just won a championship. The court stenographer lowered her gaze, biting her lip as if she wanted to say something, but she wouldn't. No one would. Because they had already decided she was guilty before she had even walked into that room. Her crime. Existing. Existing in a space they thought she didn't belong. Existing with authority they believed she shouldn't have. Existing in a way that made them uncomfortable. Her fists clenched. Not because she was afraid of prison, she had seen worse, had been in worse situations, had fought battles they could never imagine. No, it was because she could feel their victory, their satisfaction in her humiliation, the way they drank it in like the sweetest wine. The officer grabbed her arm roughly, yanking her toward the exit, his breath hot against her ear. "You should have known better than to play in our world," he murmured, just loud enough for her to hear. "Now, you're gonna learn your place." She didn't fight. She didn't struggle. Instead, she did something they weren't expecting. She smiled. A slow, calculated smile that made the officer's grip falter for just a second. "Are you done?" she asked, her voice calm, steady. His smirk returned. "Oh, I'm just getting started." Her fingers twitched, itching to reach for the small card tucked securely inside her pocket. The card that would change everything. The card that would turn the entire courtroom upside down. Because while they had spent all this time celebrating, laughing, humiliating her, they had forgotten to do the one thing that mattered most. They had forgotten to check who she really was. And when they did, when the truth was laid bare for the entire world to see, what happened next left every single person in that room absolutely speechless. But by then, it was already too late. Before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to say this loud and clear: Plow of Twist stands firmly against racism in all its forms. We believe in justice, equality, and the power of truth. If you've ever faced discrimination, know that your voice matters, your story matters, and you are not alone. This story is about resilience, justice, and turning the tables on corruption and hate. So sit back, stay engaged, and enjoy the ride. And hey, if you believe in powerful storytelling with real impact, hit that subscribe button and be part of this journey with us. Now, let's get into the story. The air inside the courtroom was thick, not just with the scent of polished wood and stale coffee, but with something heavier, something suffocating. The weight of unspoken words, the quiet power plays, the silent calculations of those who had already decided the fate of the woman standing at the center of it all. Her name was Maya Carter. 36 years old. A seasoned professional, highly educated, trained for the kind of work that most people wouldn't dare to do. Her resume alone could silence a room, but none of that mattered here. Not today. Not to these people. They didn't see the degrees from Princeton and Georgetown, the years spent training at Quantico, the commendations she had received for cracking some of the most complex cases in the country. They saw none of it. Because Maya Carter was a black woman. And in the eyes of men like Officer Daniel Cross and Judge Raymond Whitaker, that was all they needed to see. The city they ruled over wasn't unique. A typical southern town dressed in modern facades, but with the same old foundations of power. The police department was Cross's kingdom. He walked through its halls like he owned the very bricks that held it up. He was the kind of officer who had been in the force too long, a man who believed that the badge gave him the right to dictate who was innocent and who was guilty. He had built his career on arrests that no one questioned, charges that no one investigated, and a justice system that always seemed to favor men like him. And then there was Judge Whitaker. The final nail in the coffin of every black soul that entered his courtroom. He wore his robes like armor, his gavel like a weapon. A man who saw fairness as a nuisance, an inconvenience that slowed down the machine he had spent years perfecting. A man who had sentenced innocent men to life in prison with a smirk on his face, who had turned trials into spectacles, who had ensured that the powerful walked free while the vulnerable rotted away. For Maya, this wasn't just another case. This wasn't just another injustice in a long line of them. This was personal. But they didn't know that. Not yet. The events that led her here had unfolded so quickly, so ruthlessly, that it almost felt unreal. A week ago, she had been in Washington, standing in a room full of agents, briefing them on the latest findings of an undercover operation that had been months in the making. It was supposed to be routine. But nothing about what happened next was routine. A name had appeared on their radar, Judge Raymond Whitaker. Bribes. Cover-ups. A network so deep that the corruption didn't just trickle down, it flooded every level of the system. Officers, prosecutors, entire courtrooms tainted by dirty money. And at the center of it all was the man who sat before her now, the man who held her fate in his hands like a trophy he had already won. It had been a risk coming to this town alone. But Maya Carter didn't scare easily. She had spent her entire life fighting to be where she was, and she wasn't about to let men like Cross and Whitaker erase her with the stroke of a pen. But she had underestimated just how deep their power ran. She had arrived in town 2 days ago, disguised as an out-of-town consultant. The plan had been simple: observe, gather intel, and leave before anyone even knew she was there. But someone had found out. It had happened so fast. 1 minute she was walking back to her hotel, her mind racing with the pieces of the puzzle she was starting to put together, and the next, she was being slammed against a police car, Cross's knee digging into her back as he whispered filth into her ear. He had planted something on her. A small plastic bag filled with a substance she had never touched in her life. The arrest had been instantaneous. No questions. No rights read. No opportunity to explain. And now, she stood here. In front of Judge Whitaker, in the middle of his kingdom. The courtroom was packed. Officers, lawyers, journalists who wouldn't dare write the truth even if they saw it with their own eyes. The town had heard whispers of a big case, and they had come to watch it unfold like a public execution. Cross stood by the prosecution's table, arms crossed, grinning like a man who had just won the lottery. Whitaker adjusted his glasses, looking down at her with the kind of condescension that could strip a person of their very humanity. The case against her was laughable. Fabricated evidence. Falsified reports. Witnesses who didn't exist. But in this courtroom, truth didn't matter. Justice was a game played by men who had already decided the outcome before the first move was made. Whitaker took his time. He enjoyed this. The slow destruction of a person's life. The way the weight of his words could crush someone without ever touching them. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice dripping with mockery, "it seems you found yourself in quite the predicament." Cross snorted from his seat, shaking his head. "These people never learn." Laughter rippled through the room. Maya's jaw clenched, but she stayed silent. "Not yet." Whitaker leaned forward, folding his hands on the bench. "I'd ask if you had anything to say in your defense, but let's be honest. It wouldn't change anything." That was it. That was the moment. The moment when she saw it in their eyes, the certainty. The absolute, unwavering belief that they had won. That she was powerless. That she was done. But what they didn't know, what none of them realized, was that Maya Carter never walked into a room without a plan. And this? This was just the beginning. The sharp bite of cold steel around Maya Carter's wrists was nothing compared to the weight pressing down on her chest as Officer Daniel Cross yanked her forward, his fingers digging into her arm with unnecessary force, dragging her out of the courtroom and into the long, dimly lit hallway beyond. The echoes of laughter, hushed conversations, and murmurs of satisfaction from inside the courtroom lingered behind her, a cruel reminder that the people in that room weren't just witnesses to her humiliation, they were enjoying it. They had wanted this. They had waited for this. And now, they were reveling in it, as if it were some twisted form of entertainment. Maya had seen plenty of injustices in her time. She had spent years working deep within the system, exposing the corruption that festered beneath the surface, watching men like Cross operate with impunity, protected by the same laws they twisted to serve their own interests. But never had she experienced it firsthand like this. Never had she been the one standing on the other side, being dragged away like an animal, treated as if she were some common criminal, while men in power sneered at her suffering as if it were their birthright to do so. Cross walked with a cocky stride, his grip tight around her arm, his body language exuding the kind of arrogance that could only come from a man who believed he had already won. He was a predator in his prime, confident in his dominance, assured that nothing could shake his control. "I gotta tell you," Cross muttered, his voice thick with amusement, his lips curling into a smirk as he glanced at her, mocking her with his tone, as if he were speaking to a child who had just learned a harsh lesson about the world. This might be one of the best days of my damn life." He chuckled to himself, shaking his head, clearly enjoying every second of this moment. "I mean, I've seen a lot of dumb people walk through that courtroom thinking they had a chance, but you take the cake." He tugged her forward roughly, making sure she stumbled just enough to remind her of his control. His grip tightened, his fingers pressing into her skin, bruising her, even though she didn't give him the satisfaction of reacting. "You really thought you could waltz into our town, play the big shot, and then just walk away? Unscathed? Damn, sweetheart. You're either crazy or just plain stupid." Maya clenched her jaw, her face impassive, her breathing slow and measured. She had spent too many years mastering the art of control to break now. Cross wanted to see her flinch. He wanted to see her squirm, to beg, to plead, to give him something, anything, to feed his sick, twisted ego. But she wouldn't. Not now. Not ever. His smirk widened when she didn't respond. "Oh, what? Cat got your tongue? Where's all that confidence you had back in court, huh? Thought you were so damn smart, so damn above everyone else. Guess what? You're not." His voice dipped lower, his grip even tighter. "You're just another statistic now. Another inmate. Another number in the system." He yanked her down the hallway, turning a sharp corner, leading her away from the public areas of the courthouse, where the reporters, the spectators, and the rest of the world could see. No, Cross wanted this moment for himself. He wanted to savor it. He wanted to make sure that when he looked back on this day, he could remember every detail of her downfall. Let me tell you something, he murmured, his voice low, his breath warm against her ear as he leaned in close, his tone dripping with venom. All that education, all that training, all those years thinking you were something special, none of it means shit now. The second I put those cuffs on you, you were done. The second Judge Whitaker read your verdict, you were finished. And the best part? He let out a satisfied chuckle. There's not a damn thing you can do about it. Maya remained silent, her eyes fixed forward, her expression unreadable. But deep inside her, rage burned. Not just because of what was happening to her, but because she knew how many others had stood exactly where she was standing now, had been dragged through these very same halls, had been thrown into this same broken system, had been sentenced before they even stepped foot in the courtroom. The difference was that she wasn't just some victim of the system. She was inside the system. And these men? These pathetic, power-drunk men? They had no idea what they had just done. Cross shoved her forward again, leading her toward a heavy metal door at the end of the hallway. As he reached for the handle, another voice rang out from behind them. Cross. Move it along. We don't have all day. Maya didn't turn, but she recognized the voice immediately. Officer Lillian Parks. One of the few officers in the department who had stayed quiet throughout the entire ordeal. She wasn't like the others, wasn't openly mocking Maya, wasn't celebrating like Cross, wasn't relishing in her downfall. But that didn't mean she was an ally either. No one in this town was. Cross let out an exaggerated sigh and turned toward Parks, his grin never faltering. Relax, Parks. Just having a little chat. Save it, she replied flatly. Get her loaded up. Maya felt Cross's fingers flex around her arm before he yanked the door open and led her outside into the harsh afternoon light. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that clung to your skin like a second layer, suffocating, heavy. A transport van sat waiting, its back doors open, the final destination for people who never made it back out. Cross smirked as he gestured toward the vehicle. Time to go, sweetheart. He leaned in one last time, close enough that Maya could feel the heat of his breath against her skin. You should have stayed in D.C., he murmured, his voice thick with satisfaction. Maya let him push her inside. Let the doors slam shut behind her. Let the sound of the lock clicking into place echo through the empty steel walls. Then, slowly, her lips curled into a small, knowing smile. Because they thought they had her. But what they didn't know, what none of them realized, was that this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The van rumbled over the uneven pavement, its interior dimly lit by the faint slivers of light slipping through the reinforced steel vents. The air inside was thick, stale, carrying the weight of countless souls who had sat in this very spot before her, stripped of their freedom, their dignity, their hope. Maya Carter sat motionless, her hands resting on her lap, her expression unreadable. Outside, the world moved, but inside, time felt frozen, stretched thin by the suffocating silence. Cross sat in the front seat, chatting with the driver, his voice thick with amusement. Every now and then, a chuckle drifted back to her, the sound laced with satisfaction. He thought he had won. Thought she was just another case, another name on a file that would be buried beneath bureaucratic nonsense, forgotten by the world. The weight of his arrogance pressed against her like an unbearable heat, but she didn't let it touch her. She remained still, waiting. Watching. The van slowed, turning sharply onto a road she hadn't expected. Her gaze flicked to the small, barred window on the side, catching glimpses of the scenery shifting outside. They weren't headed to the detention center. No. This road was leading somewhere else. Somewhere quieter. Cross's voice carried back to her again, this time lower, more purposeful. She's a loose end, he muttered to the driver, his tone casual, as if he were discussing the weather. We can't risk it. Whitaker wants this handled before she gets anywhere near a federal holding facility. Maya exhaled slowly. There it was. The final piece of the puzzle. The reason for the detour. They weren't taking her to be processed. They were taking her to be eliminated. The realization settled over her, not as panic, but as confirmation. She had known the moment they set this up that they wouldn't let her make it to trial. That was never the plan. Men like Cross and Whitaker didn't take chances. They cleaned up their messes before they could spill over. And they thought she was just another mess. The van came to a stop, the sudden stillness pressing against her skin. Cross hopped out first, the sound of his boots crunching against gravel. The back doors swung open, and there he stood, his silhouette framed against the backdrop of an empty lot, a stretch of land forgotten by time, far from prying eyes. His smirk was still there, but there was something else now. Eagerness. End of the road, he drawled, tilting his head, motioning for her to move. Let's go. Maya didn't resist. She stepped out carefully, her eyes scanning the surroundings. No cameras. No witnesses. Just them. Cross adjusted his belt, rolling his shoulders like a man preparing for something he had done many times before. He glanced at the driver, a younger officer who looked far less certain about what was happening. Go on, kid. Take a walk. You don't need to see this. The officer hesitated, his hands twitching at his sides. He didn't speak, but his silence was telling. This wasn't what he had signed up for. But he wouldn't stop it either. He wouldn't be the one to challenge Cross. Coward. Maya stood there, watching, waiting, her heartbeat slow and controlled. She could feel the shift in the air, the way Cross squared his shoulders, how he reached for his gun, fingers grazing the holster. He was enjoying this. I gotta admit, he said, shaking his head, laughing under his breath. I thought you'd be more, what's the word? Defiant. I expected more fight. But look at you. Standing there like you already know how this ends. Maya let a small, almost imperceptible smile cross her lips. Oh, I do. Cross's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, just a flicker of hesitation, but it was there. Maya took a slow step forward, her posture unthreatening, calm. You never checked, did you? She murmured. Cross's brow furrowed, his fingers twitching at his side. Checked what? She tilted her head slightly. Who I am. Cross let out a sharp, mocking laugh, shaking his head. I know exactly who you are, sweetheart. You're a nobody. You were a problem, and now you're about to be gone. That's all I need to know. Maya inhaled deeply, then let the moment settle, let the weight of her next action crush the silence between them. And then, she moved. Smooth. Precise. Deadly. Her hands slipped under her jacket, past the folds of fabric where the small, laminated identification card had been tucked away since the beginning of this nightmare. And as she pulled it out, as she flipped it open, as the unmistakable golden insignia of the Federal Bureau of Investigation gleamed under the dull afternoon light, she watched everything change. Cross's face froze. The color drained from his skin so fast it looked like someone had just ripped the life out of him. His smirk disappeared, his mouth parting slightly, as if his brain had short-circuited, trying to process what he was seeing. Maya's voice was calm. Cold. Steady. I'm FBI, Officer Cross. Undercover. Silence slammed into the space between them. Cross staggered back, blinking rapidly, his jaw tightening, his entire body going rigid. You're lying, he rasped, but there was no conviction in his words. Maya took a step closer, holding the badge up, letting the reality sink in. You really should have checked before you started celebrating. Cross's breathing turned ragged, his shoulders rising and falling in shallow, uneven jerks. His fingers twitched near his holster, but he didn't dare move. Maya leaned in slightly, just enough to lower her voice. You think you're untouchable. That no one can touch you because this town is yours. But let me tell you something, Daniel. I wasn't working alone. His eyes widened. Maya tilted her head, enjoying the way his panic started to crack through the surface, the way his entire demeanor shifted from dominance to pure, unfiltered terror. See, the thing about an operation like this, she continued, her voice almost gentle, deadly in its precision. You were being watched the whole time. Every conversation. Every move. And you just, what was it you said? Handed me exactly what I needed. Cross stumbled back, his breath shaking now. No, but it was too late. Because before he could run, before he could reach for the gun he had been so ready to use, the deafening sound of sirens split through the air. And then, they came. Black SUVs swarming in from all directions, tires screeching against pavement, doors slamming open, agents pouring out like a wave of unstoppable force. Cross turned, his face frozen in horror, his mind finally catching up to reality. Maya exhaled, watching as his entire world collapsed around him. And then, she whispered, just loud enough for him to hear, just loud enough to let him drown in it. Game over. The moment the sirens split through the air, Daniel Cross's entire body tensed like a man staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. His eyes darted wildly, scanning for an escape that didn't exist, his breath coming in shallow, panicked bursts. The weight of his reality crashed down on him in waves, suffocating, unrelenting. The arrogance that had defined him, that had oozed from his every word, vanished. The certainty, the power, the untouchable bravado, gone. Maya Carter watched him unravel with a calm that had been years in the making. Her heartbeat was steady, her hands loose at her sides, her stance unwavering. The wind lifted strands of her hair, but she didn't move. She just stood there, letting it happen. Letting him feel it. Letting him drown in the weight of his own fate. Cross stumbled back, his boots scraping against the uneven pavement as he whipped his head toward the incoming wave of black SUVs, their tinted windows glinting under the dull afternoon light. The sound of slamming doors, the crunch of heavy boots hitting the ground, the sharp commands of federal agents moving into position, it all hit him too fast, too hard, like an unstoppable force crashing against a man who had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable. No, 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 Cross muttered under his breath, shaking his head, his hands twitching near his belt, hovering over the holster that suddenly felt useless. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came. There was nothing to say. Maya tilted her head slightly, watching the cracks in him widen, watching him break. You thought you were in control, she murmured, her voice soft, sharp, lethal. You really believed you'd get away with it. That I was just going to disappear. That no one was watching. That no one was coming. Cross's breathing was erratic now, his pupils dilated, his skin turning a shade paler by the second. This is bullshit, he spat, but his voice lacked its usual venom, the confidence drained from it like a hollow shell. This is a setup, Maya let out a slow breath, almost disappointed. You still don't get it, do you? She said, stepping closer, just enough to make him flinch. The moment you put those cuffs on me, the moment you dragged me into that courtroom, the moment you laughed, you sealed your fate. She watched his hands twitch again, his instinct to fight back still trying to surface through the panic. And the worst part? You did it all to yourself. Cross's eyes darted to the other officers, to the ones who had followed him for years, the ones who had always had his back. But something had changed. There was fear now. Hesitation. Some of them weren't even looking at him. They knew. They had always known what kind of man he was, but now. Now they knew there was no saving him. And then the voice came. Step away from the suspect, Officer Cross. The command cut through the air like a blade. A tall man in a sharp suit, Special Agent Thomas Grayson, stood at the center of the storm, his badge gleaming under the sun, his expression unreadable. Behind him, other federal agents moved into formation, their weapons lowered but ready. Cross's head snapped toward him, his lips parting, his hands now slightly raised, not in surrender, but in desperation. "Grayson, listen to me." "No," Grayson interrupted, his voice flat, unshakable. "You listen." He took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them, his sharp eyes never wavering. "We have everything. The wiretaps. The falsified reports. The bribes. The planted evidence." He nodded toward Maya without breaking eye contact with Cross. "And now? We have her testimony." Cross shook his head violently, his teeth gritted, his body coiled, as if his very existence depended on finding a way out. This is a fucking setup," he hissed, his voice raw with desperation. "You don't have shit." Maya let out a quiet laugh, a sound that sent a visible shudder through him. "Oh, we have plenty." And then she reached into her jacket and pulled out her phone. Cross's stomach dropped. The screen lit up, the audio player still running, still recording, the timestamp flashing, confirming every single second of his own words. Maya's gaze bore into him as she held up the phone. "Your confession," she murmured. "Right here. Every single word. You bragging about planting evidence. You calling Judge Whittaker to clean up the mess. You celebrating my disappearance. Every damn word." Cross staggered. His chest rose and fell in short, shallow bursts, his face frozen in pure, undiluted horror. His lips moved, but no words came. It was over. Maya watched him come to terms with it in real time, watched his entire existence unravel in the span of seconds. And then she leaned in, just enough to let her voice carry over the chaos. "You should have checked who you were dealing with." The next moment was pure silence. And then, chaos. "Daniel Cross, you are under arrest." The words hit like a gunshot, tearing through the air, sending a ripple of shock through the surrounding officers. Before Cross could react, before he could even think about reaching for his weapon, for federal agents were on him, forcing him to the ground, their hands pressing him down just like he had done to so many others. "Don't you fucking touch me!" Cross screamed, thrashing, his body convulsing in blind panic, but there was no escape now. No power left to abuse. He was hauled up roughly, his hands wrenched behind his back, the same metallic bite of handcuffs that he had taken such pleasure in using on others now wrapping around his own wrists. Maya stepped back, watching as they pushed him forward, the once untouchable officer now just another criminal. And then, as if fate had saved its final act for the perfect moment, another car pulled up, a black sedan, sleek and imposing. The door opened. And Judge Raymond Whittaker stepped out. The second his eyes landed on Cross, his most loyal officer, being shoved toward the waiting vehicle, his entire face dropped. For the first time in his long, untouchable career, fear flickered in his cold, dead eyes. And Maya saw it. She smiled. Because this was just the beginning. The weight of the moment still lingered in the air, thick and suffocating, pressing down on everyone in its path. Cross was no longer the man he had been minutes ago, no longer the untouchable officer, no longer the one who dictated the rules. Now, he was the suspect, his wrists bound in the same steel that he had locked around so many others without a second thought. He wasn't walking with his usual swagger, wasn't smirking like he always had. His face was twisted into something raw, something almost inhuman, a mixture of shock, rage, and pure, unfiltered terror. The federal agents kept their grip firm on him as they dragged him toward the black SUV, his boots scraping against the pavement. He tried to twist, to pull away, but there was nowhere to go. He was trapped. He could feel it, the finality of it all, the way the world was closing in around him, the way the very system he had abused was now swallowing him whole. His breathing was erratic, his chest rising and falling in short, uneven bursts, his mind racing through every possibility, every loophole, every way out. But there was nothing. Judge Whittaker was still frozen, standing just feet away, his entire world crashing down in slow motion. His suit was pristine, his tie perfectly straight, but nothing about his presence felt powerful anymore. He had spent decades in control, playing his part like a master chess player, ensuring that every piece was exactly where he needed it to be. But now, for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one holding the board. He had seen men crumble in his courtroom, had watched as he took their futures from them with the flick of his wrist, had reveled in the way they begged for mercy. But today, it was his turn. Maya stepped forward slowly, her movements deliberate, her eyes locked on Whitaker's face. He didn't look at her, couldn't. His hands twitched at his sides, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like his teeth might crack under the pressure. He was calculating, his mind desperate to find a way to salvage this, to shift the narrative, to make sure he didn't go down with Cross. But there was no move left to make. Maya could see the thoughts flashing through his head, the desperate grasping at straws, the years of unchecked power that had made him believe he was invincible. But now he looked small. She let the silence stretch just long enough for it to become unbearable, just long enough to let him feel it, to make him understand that this was real. Then, finally, she spoke. "You're looking a little pale, Judge," she murmured, tilting her head, watching the way his throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Whitaker inhaled sharply, forcing his shoulders back, trying to summon whatever was left of the man he had been moments ago. "This is a mistake," he said, his voice low, steady, but not nearly as strong as he wanted it to be. "You don't know what you're doing." Maya's lips curved slightly, but there was no amusement in her expression. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing." Whitaker's hands curled into fists, his knuckles turning white. "You have nothing," he snapped, his composure beginning to crack. "You think you've won? You think this," he gestured toward Cross, toward the federal agents, toward the entire scene unraveling in front of him, "is enough? You have no idea who you're dealing with." Maya took another step closer, just enough to see the flicker of panic in his eyes when he realized that she wasn't intimidated. "That's where you're wrong," she said, her voice calm, unwavering. "Because I know exactly who I'm dealing with. And I know exactly how this ends." Whitaker's nostrils flared, his chest heaving slightly as his composure began to shatter. He had always believed that power was permanent, that as long as he controlled the system, he controlled everything. But now, standing here, in this moment, with his empire crumbling around him, he was faced with a truth he had never prepared for. Maya could feel the weight of history pressing down on them, could feel the echoes of every single person this man had destroyed, of every life he had ruined, every innocent person he had condemned. She thought of the names, the files, the reports she had read late into the night, each one another casualty of his corruption. And now, it was his name that was about to be written in those reports. Behind them, Cross was still thrashing, his body convulsing in blind panic as the agents tried to restrain him. "This is bullshit," he howled, his voice cracking under the weight of his own fear. "You can't do this. You don't get to do this to me." Maya barely spared him a glance. "Funny," she mused. "That's exactly what the last man you arrested said." Cross's face twisted, his features contorting into something almost unrecognizable. His entire body was vibrating with rage, with humiliation, with the undeniable realization that he had lost. And then, something shifted. A sound. A ripple through the crowd. Maya turned just in time to see it, officers hesitating. Not just the federal agents, but the local cops, the ones who had always stood behind Cross, the ones who had laughed along with him, who had watched him do unspeakable things and had never said a word. Now, they looked uncertain. Now, they looked like men who were questioning everything. And that was power. Because this wasn't just about Cross. It wasn't just about Whitaker. This was about all of them. This was about a system that had let men like them thrive, that had allowed corruption to fester, that had turned people like Maya into targets for simply daring to exist in a space they weren't meant to be in. And now, the tide was turning. Maya let her gaze sweep over the crowd, let her presence sink into the cracks of their foundation. She could see the shifts, the uncertainty, the fear, the understanding that this was bigger than just today. Whitaker must have felt it too, because suddenly, his bravado collapsed. His shoulders slumped. His hands twitched at his sides. And for the first time since this had started, he looked afraid. Maya exhaled slowly, letting the weight of everything settle. Then, finally, she spoke. "You should call your lawyer." And as Whitaker stood there, his entire life unraveling in front of him, as Cross was dragged toward the waiting SUV, screaming, fighting the inevitable, the reality sank in. They weren't just losing today. They had already lost everything. The weight of it all was still settling in, pressing down like a heavy storm cloud over everyone present. The courthouse steps, once a place where Judge Whitaker stood as an untouchable force, now served as the ground where his power bled out, seeping into the cracks beneath his polished shoes. The murmurs in the crowd were no longer whispers of admiration or quiet deference, they were laced with something far more potent. Doubt. Suspicion. Betrayal. The same men who had bowed their heads in his presence, who had shaken his hand and laughed at his offhand, racist remarks, now stood at a distance, watching as the last shreds of his authority crumbled into nothing. Whitaker's jaw was tight, his hands twitching, fingers flexing at his sides as if he were trying to grab hold of something solid, something real, something that could stop the inevitable descent. But there was nothing. He had spent years ruling over this town with an iron grip, turning justice into nothing more than a performance, a stage where he played God. And now? Now, he was nothing more than a man in freefall, waiting to hit the ground. Maya Carter didn't rush the moment. She let it sink in, let the realization curl around him like a noose tightening with every second that passed. She had seen this before, the exact moment a man realizes he is not untouchable, that the world is no longer bending to his will, that he is not, in fact, above the law. It was a beautiful kind of destruction. Slow. Merciless. Deserved. Whitaker's lips parted slightly, as if he was about to speak, but no words came. He exhaled sharply through his nose, shoulders rising and falling in a controlled breath that did nothing to mask the panic creeping into his gaze. Maya took a slow step forward, tilting her head slightly as she studied him. "You spent your whole life deciding other people's fates," she murmured, her voice calm, almost gentle. "And now, for the first time, you don't get to decide your own." Whitaker's jaw clenched tighter, his teeth grinding together so hard Maya swore she could hear it. His eyes flicked toward the federal agents, toward the officers who had once stood beside him without question. They were watching him now, but they weren't moving. They weren't intervening. No one was coming to save him. He exhaled again, his nostrils flaring as he forced himself to meet Maya's gaze. "You think this changes anything?" His voice was low, tight, barely controlled. "You think one case, one arrest, is going to—" "Yes," Maya interrupted, her voice sharper now, slicing through the weight of his words before they could even settle. "I do. Because this isn't just about you. It's about everyone who stood by and let you do this for years. It's about every man and woman who walked into your courtroom hoping for justice and walked out in chains. It's about every innocent person you condemned because they didn't fit your idea of acceptable. This is about every life you ruined." Whitaker's eyes darkened, his fingers curling into tight fists. "You think they actually care?" he spat, his voice laced with something desperate, something almost pleading. "You think the system is going to change because of this? You think they'll let you take this all the way?" Maya inhaled slowly, letting the question sit between them, letting the weight of it sink into her own skin. Because she knew the truth. She had always known. This wasn't the end. The system was bigger than one man. It was bigger than Cross. Bigger than Whitaker. Bigger than this town. It was a machine, built to protect the people who fed it, who thrived under its shadow. This wasn't victory. This was just the beginning of the war. But that didn't mean it wasn't worth fighting. Maya met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "You're right," she admitted, her voice quiet but sharp. "They'll try to bury this. They'll try to pretend it never happened. They'll try to protect their own. But you—" She took another step forward, lowering her voice, ensuring that every single syllable sliced straight through him. "You're not theirs anymore." Whitaker's breath hitched, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. "You were useful when you were untouchable," Maya continued, her voice cutting, precise. "But now—" She shook her head, watching as the panic fully set into his expression. "Now you're dead weight. And when men like you fall, they don't just let you go down, they make an example out of you." Whitaker's hands twitched, his nails digging into his palms. "I won't, you will," Maya interrupted, her voice cold, final. "Because you don't have a choice." A silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, before Whitaker finally let out a slow, shaking breath. He turned slightly, his gaze flicking to the officers who had once followed his every command. They still weren't moving. Still weren't stepping in. And in that moment, Whitaker finally understood. Maya saw it in his eyes, the moment he realized that he had already been abandoned. They weren't just letting him fall. They had already let him go. A rough hand clamped down on his shoulder, snapping him out of whatever spiral his mind had been falling into. He barely had time to react before two federal agents flanked him, gripping his arms, securing him like a suspect, like every man he had sentenced before. His breathing hitched. He tried to shake them off, tried to summon whatever power he still believed he had, but it was useless. "Judge Raymond Whitaker," one of the agents began, his voice cold and professional, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, bribery, and the unlawful sentencing of innocent citizens. You have the right to remain silent." Whitaker jerked violently, his eyes going wide, his entire body rejecting the words being spoken. "No," he rasped, twisting in their grip. "No, no, you don't get to," but he did. They did. The Miranda rights continued, unfazed, unbothered by the desperate man flailing against reality. Maya took a slow step back, letting the scene unfold without her. Because it didn't belong to her anymore. This was his moment. His reckoning. His end. And as they dragged him toward the waiting vehicle, as the weight of everything he had done crashed into him all at once, as the world watched, Maya Carter did the one thing he never expected. She turned. And she walked away. Because his story was over. The weight of the day settled in like a slow-moving storm, heavy and unrelenting, wrapping itself around every person who had witnessed the fall of Daniel Cross and Judge Whitaker. The air was thick with tension, the kind that lingers in the space between what was and what comes next. The crowd, once loud with murmurs of disbelief and quiet satisfaction, had begun to thin out, but the energy in the atmosphere remained. The courthouse steps, which had once served as a pedestal for men who had wielded unchecked power, were now a stark reminder that no throne was permanent. Maya Carter stood at the edge of it all, watching as the world shifted around her. The agents were still working, their voices low and efficient as they processed the arrests, but she could see it in their faces, the realization that something irreversible had happened here today. This wasn't just another case. This wasn't just another corrupt official being taken down. This was a break in the system, a crack in the foundation that had long been assumed unshakable. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. She had spent years fighting for this moment, for something like this to happen, for proof that justice, real justice, was possible. And now that it was here, now that she had done exactly what she set out to do, there was something unsettling about the stillness that followed. It was over. But only for them. She turned slightly, catching sight of one of the younger officers lingering near the courthouse entrance, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. He had been there when she was arrested, had watched as Cross paraded her through the halls like a trophy. He hadn't said a word then, hadn't interfered, hadn't done anything to stop it. But now, he was watching her with something different in his eyes, something uncertain, something that almost looked like guilt. Maya exhaled slowly before taking a step toward him. The movement made him straighten instantly, as if he were preparing for some kind of confrontation. She stopped a few feet away, keeping her voice low, controlled. "What's your name?" The officer hesitated, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. "Dawson." "Dawson," Maya repeated, testing the name on her tongue. She let the silence stretch for a moment before she spoke again. "You were there." Dawson's shoulders tensed, and she saw the flicker of something in his expression, remorse, maybe, or the uncomfortable sting of accountability. He shifted, his jaw tightening. "I was." Maya studied him carefully. "And you did nothing." His lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze flicking downward for a second before snapping back up to meet hers. He looked ashamed, but he didn't deny it. He inhaled sharply. "I didn't know how to." That answer settled between them, thick and heavy. Maya let it sit for a moment, let him feel the weight of it. "You saw what he was doing," she continued, her voice even but sharp. "You heard what he said. You watched. And you didn't stop him." Dawson's throat worked as he swallowed again, the muscles in his jaw clenching. He looked like he wanted to speak, like there was something he wanted to say but couldn't quite bring himself to. Instead, he took a slow breath, shaking his head. "I was scared." Maya didn't blink. "Of what?" Dawson let out a humorless chuckle, his hands twitching at his sides. "Of Cross. Of Whitaker. Of what would happen if I went against them." Maya tilted her head slightly, watching him. "And what would have happened?" Dawson hesitated. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe nothing. Maybe I would have been fired. Maybe they would have turned on me. Maybe worse. But," he exhaled sharply, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "I didn't want to find out." Maya studied him, the tension in his posture, the wariness in his eyes. She had spent enough time reading people to know the difference between regret and genuine reckoning. Dawson wasn't making excuses. He wasn't trying to shift blame. He was just standing in the wreckage of his own inaction, finally seeing it for what it was. "And now?" Maya asked, her voice softer now but no less pointed. "What happens next, Dawson?" Dawson opened his mouth, then closed it, his throat working as he struggled to find an answer that wasn't empty. He looked over at the scene behind them, Cross, still thrashing in the grip of the agents, spewing curses, his entire existence imploding in real time. Whitaker, standing stiffly as his rights were read to him, his expression unreadable, but his silence deafening. The officers who had once laughed alongside them now standing in uncertain clusters, unsure of their place in a world where men like Cross and Whitaker could actually fall. Finally, Dawson turned back to her, his voice quieter now, rough around the edges. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I know I don't want to be like them." Maya let that answer sit between them. It wasn't enough. Not yet. But it was a start. She nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Then do better." Dawson swallowed hard, nodding stiffly in return. He didn't say anything else, but Maya could see it in his face, the wheels turning, the slow, painful process of undoing years of conditioning, of realizing that silence wasn't neutrality, that fear didn't absolve responsibility. It wouldn't fix everything. It wouldn't erase what had happened. But maybe, just maybe, it meant that the next time a man like Cross tried to wield his power like a weapon, Dawson wouldn't just stand by and watch. Maya turned away, her gaze settling on the agents finishing their work, the reporters scrambling to piece together what had just unfolded, the shifting landscape of a town that had never expected to be shaken like this. She took in a slow, steady breath. This was far from over. Because Cross and Whitaker weren't the disease. They were just symptoms. And Maya Carter wasn't done yet. The trial that followed was nothing short of a spectacle. For years, Daniel Cross and Judge Raymond Whitaker had controlled the narrative, bending the law to their will, ensuring that their actions never saw the light of day. But this time, they were the ones being dissected. Every lie, every manipulated case, every injustice they had orchestrated came to the surface like rotting corpses dragged from the depths. Cross tried to fight it at first. He sat in the defendant's chair like a man still convinced he could talk his way out of the inevitable. He glared at Maya Carter every chance he got, resentment burning in his eyes, but it was fear that had truly settled into his bones. He had spent his career forcing people into confessions, making them crumble under pressure, watching them break. He thought he was untouchable. But now, he was nothing. The prosecution laid out everything, the falsified reports, the planted evidence, the recordings that Maya had captured, his words damning him in ways he never saw coming. He had given them the rope, and now, they were hanging him with it. His defense team tried to spin it, to make it seem like the system was targeting him, like he was the victim, but no one bought it. Because for the first time, his word wasn't enough. The jury returned the verdict faster than anyone expected. Guilty. On all counts. When the judge read his sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole, Cross finally lost it. He shot up from his seat, his face twisted in pure, uncontrolled rage, his voice cracking under the weight of his own downfall. "This is bullshit," he shouted, his hands clenching into fists, his body vibrating with fury. "I put criminals away. I made this city safe. You're gonna let some bitch FBI agent take everything from me? You're all just as dirty as..." He never finished the sentence. The bailiffs were on him before he could move an inch, shoving him down, restraining him as he thrashed like a caged animal, the reality finally sinking in. Maya watched from the other side of the courtroom, her expression unreadable. She had won. But it didn't feel like victory. Not yet. Then came Whitaker's turn. Unlike Cross, he didn't fight it. He knew the weight of what was coming. Knew that the moment the world turned on him, he was done. The system had protected him for decades, but now that he was a liability, he had been abandoned just as quickly. His allies distanced themselves, his name was removed from plaques, his legacy erased like it had never existed. He sat there in his expensive suit, aged by the weight of his own sins, his hands shaking slightly as he listened to his charges being read out. Bribery. Conspiracy. Obstruction of justice. The list went on, each accusation stripping away another layer of the power he once held. When the verdict came, guilty, he didn't react. He just stared ahead, as if he had already known. His sentence? 30 years in federal prison. A fate worse than death for a man who once ruled over others like a god. The last time Maya saw him, he was being escorted out of the courtroom, his shoulders slumped, his hands trembling, his face ghostly pale. The fire that had once burned in his eyes was gone, replaced by something hollow, something that whispered of a man already rotting from the inside out. It was done. And yet, Maya knew this was just the beginning. The media storm that followed was relentless. Headlines screamed about corruption, about the abuse of power, about the justice system being turned inside out. People marched in the streets, demanding more investigations, demanding that every case Cross and Whitaker had ever touched be reopened. The floodgates had opened. And the system was being forced to look at itself in the mirror. As for Maya, she returned to Washington, but she wasn't the same woman who had walked into that courthouse weeks ago. She had spent years believing in the law, believing that justice could be found if you just fought hard enough. But now, she knew the truth. Justice wasn't given. It had to be taken. It had to be dragged into the light, screaming and clawing, fighting every step of the way. And she was ready for whatever fight came next. Because this was her calling. She sat in her office, staring out at the city skyline, the files of other corrupt officials, other dirty cops, other broken systems stacked high on her desk. There was still so much left to do. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see Dawson standing there, a little hesitant, but with something different in his stance. Conviction. He had left that town. Resigned from the force. Started over. "I want to help," he said, his voice firm, no longer laced with fear. Maya studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Then let's get to work." And just like that, the fight continued. Now, let me ask you, how many times have we seen this story play out in real life? How many Daniel Crosses and Judge Whittakers have walked free while innocent people suffered? How many times has the system protected the corrupt and turned its back on those who needed justice the most? This isn't just fiction. This is reality. And the only way it ever changes is if we force it to. What do you think? Do you believe justice always prevails, or do you think the system is too broken to fix? Let me know in the comments. And if you believe in stories that expose the truth, that hold power accountable, that make you think, then make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more. Because trust me, there's always another story to tell.